Confession is hard, especially if we are unsure about what is a sin and what is an imperfection. One of our viewers asked a question about how to understand what to confess, and I will be addressing that question today, so stick around. Hello, my name is Father Ambrose Little, and I teach philosophy at the Dominican House of Studies. Welcome to Aquinas 101, Big Questions, Little Answers, the series where I do my best to answer your big questions about philosophy, theology, and more. Here is a question from a viewer about confession. I am still confused what is a mortal sin and what is just an imperfection which gets in the way when confessing and during an examination of conscience. What are examples of imperfections versus mortal sin? For example, is someone who's always rude and angry, like Peter Parker or Spider-Man's boss, John, sinning because he treats his employees without patience? Or is it not a sin and just an imperfection? Our viewer frames the question in terms of confusion over mortal sin versus imperfections. But the example of Spider-Man's boss and his habitual disposition to rudeness brings up a different question, namely about the relationship between habits and actions. I will look at these in relationship to an examination of conscience and how to prepare for confession. The first thing to remember about confession is that we are asked to confess sins, not dispositions or feelings. Sins are concrete actions that we have done or ought to have done. As Father Petrie says in his Aquinas 101 video on the subject, St. Thomas describes sin as a word, thought, or deed contrary to the love of God, neighbor, and even ourselves. It can also be a concrete action that we did not do, called a sin of omission. Now notice what that means. A sin is a concrete thing, an individual thought, word, or deed. It is something that we do deliberately or don't do in the case of sins of omission. So when we are preparing for confession, what we should be examining our conscience for are these concrete sins. Now, how do virtue and vice relate to our actions? Remember that virtues and vices are habits, that is, they are stable dispositions to act in a particular way. That is important to remember, because the way we use the word virtue or vice in English tends to refer to concrete actions, not dispositions. So we call actions virtuous or vicious. That is not completely wrong, but it is confusing. An action is virtuous or vicious insofar as the doing of a particular action has its root in a particular disposition. What makes a particular disposition a virtue or a vice is the object of the action we are disposed to doing, or what it is we are disposed to do. To give an example, take a virtuoso pianist. The pianist sits down to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The playing of the concerto well and with ease is the concrete action informed by virtue. What makes the action virtuous is that it is good to do and comes from a developed disposition to play well. So concrete actions are made virtuous and vicious because they come from a habit ordered to a particular object and are influenced in their perfection or imperfection by the habit that gives rise to the action. What does this mean concretely for confession? While it is helpful for a confessor to know whether or not your concrete actions stem from a developed habit of vice, what is important is to confess concrete sins, not necessarily the habit itself. So in preparing for confession, focus on the facts. That being said, thoughts that are sinful can be confusing. That is because we have many thoughts that come to mind in an unconscious way. In our fallen state, our imagination is apt to bring to mind certain thoughts that are disturbing and wrong. If we have a developed vice, the vice can make the occurrence of these thoughts more frequent and vivid. One thing that St. Augustine and St. Thomas tell us is that thoughts that come to mind spontaneously, what St. Augustine calls first movements, are not sinful in themselves. What is sinful is whether or not we decide to consciously consent to the thought by deciding to dwell on it or act on it. Where the line is between consenting and not consenting to a thought gives a lot of people confusion, and I think this is the confusion that is expressed in our viewer's question. How to handle the difficulty here will depend on the individual penitent, and so I am not going to give specific advice here. Also, please don't ask me to answer specific questions about this in the comments or via email, because I only feel comfortable answering those types of questions one-on-one with a penitent. My general advice is this. Focus less on thoughts and more on concrete actions and words when you come to confession. If you are worried about thoughts and their level of sinfulness, my advice is to find a regular confessor whom you can trust and ask his advice on what to confess and what not to confess. Also, do not be afraid. In confession, God is giving you mercy through the ministry of his priest. He's not playing gotcha. As the psalmist says, quote, "If you, O Lord, should mark our guilt, Lord, who would survive? But with you is found forgiveness. For this we revere you." End quote. God is merciful, so do not be afraid of your wayward thoughts. He will, over time, help you to overcome them, and we must all learn to trust in his mercy completely. With that in mind, let's turn briefly to Spider-Man's boss. The example asks if he is sinning because he is habitually grumpy and rude toward his employees. The answer is, it depends. Each action itself is either sinful or not. Just being grumpy and rude is not necessarily sinful, and if it is sinful, it's probably not mortally so, unless it goes beyond simple rudeness to something more serious. Spider-Man's boss just has a grumpy disposition. Some of his actions may be sinful, others may be imperfections. What we need to evaluate are what words were said on specific occasions, and what was the reason why he said them, and in what circumstances. Spider-Man's boss and his confessor will have to work that out by examining the details of his concrete actions. Likewise with us. We must remember that in preparing for confession, we must focus on concrete actions, words, and deeds, not feelings and dispositions, and confess those concrete actions, words, and deeds. If we are worried about vicious dispositions or unwanted thoughts, bring those up, but remember that confession is about what was done or not done, not our dispositions. That's all I have for you today. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Big Questions, Little Answers. I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, may God bless you and keep you in his grace. I hope that answers all your questions, but if not, please let us know by submitting your big questions using hashtag AskAFriar in the YouTube comments and on social media. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends, because it matters what you think.